All right. Hello, and welcome back to the Gumtree of Liberty podcast. I'm your host, Stuart, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Jack, and host of the No Way Jose show and a member of the Tower Power Hour, Jose Allison. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So I guess to discuss the Anarchist Handbook, which is a great book by Michael Nelson, I recommend everyone read it, or at least some of the essays from it. I think it's important first to define what anarchy is, but first, what was your path to libertarianism, and what was your path to anarchy?
Path to libertarianism, it was kind of like a slow thing. It was a few things. I don't know, how do I put this? I talked to Reed Coverdale about this before. I went through the theism, like I basically became an atheist. At some point, I was raised in the church, and during that, going through that experience of like kind of, I guess losing my faith or whatever, like. I know I ended up getting a lot of debates with my family and stuff, and then I really like looked into like the logic of it and stuff, and so I got really into like logical tools, fallacies, stuff like that, and that was kind of what set the bedrock of like having a decent set of like logical tools to use, and those kind of came in handy throughout this process of like through libertarianism and anarchy. I don't know if I could give you like a definitive moment that I like became like a libertarian, but it was kind of as a young adult, I kind of started getting more into like podcasts and like radio and stuff like that. And I kind of like went the route of like came from the conservative like side. I was doing like Shapiro, and then I think I kind of like slowly moved from Shapiro to like Rubin, and then like kind of moving along that pathway slowly. And I think I started listening to Rogan at some point, and I want to say I found Dave Smith on Rogan. I mean, maybe it was somewhere else, but I'm pretty sure I found Dave Smith. I became a big Part of the Problem fan, and I listened to him for years. And that's kind of what I mean. I was already, I would say, a libertarian by the time I hopped on the Part of the Problem train. But to get to anarchy, Dave Smith is what kind of got me into anarchy. He would always, go on his show, talk about anatomy of the state. And I would always kind of roll my eyes when we talk about anarchy stuff. Like I thought he had a lot of good points, but I just, you always like move from one excuse to another of why anarchy doesn't work. It's kind of this shifting thing. And then after a while, he kept going on about reading Anatomy of the State, and I finally was like, okay, I'll read it. And I read it, and I was like, holy moly, like this is it. Like it kind of all the arguments clicked in place with Anatomy of the State. Like Anatomy of the State's what did it for me. Obviously by coaxing of Dave Smith through his podcast, and and that's what did it for me there. I mean, I guess it's kind of my story in a nutshell, and then now here I am. But yeah, and then it also came full circle. For those who don't realize, I don't know if you already mentioned it, but I'm doing a series on the Anarchist Handbook. I've been doing basically every chapter I'm doing an episode. I'm only like halfway through right now. I think the second one I had Dave Smith on for Anatomy of the State. And that was kind of like a cool moment, like kind of coming full circle, because Dave Smith's the one who got me reading Anatomy of the State. That's what made me an anarchist. And then I got to like then have him on the podcast to discuss it, which was kind of like a magical moment sort of. So yeah, that's my story. Yeah.
Well, as an anarchist Christian, I'm quite offended that you'd leave us and become an atheist and still be anarchist. Like, it's quite offensive to me as a Christian. So how would you define anarchy?
That's kind of a hard question to answer. I don't really have a glib one for that. I mean, obviously the Anarchist Handbook, there's multiple ways to define it. I come more from the ANCAP type perspective, although I kind of undergird it with like an egoism thing. So I don't know. I guess just more of a matter of like it's the NAP. You don't have a right to coerce against me, and once you kind of put that to its logical extension, that is what gets you to anarchy, and that's kind of where I'm at. I guess I just see the world functioning better that way. I also see myself as an independent and an actor in the world that I don't really need these things coercing me, and I would prefer them not to. I don't know. It's really hard to define. I mean, like I said, even with this book, there's multiple ways to define it. I don't really have a glib answer for anarchy. I guess I think Malice had a glib answer in there. You don't speak for me is kind of how he defined it. I haven't really come up with a good catchy way to define it myself. So
that's a pretty good one.
Yeah.
Yes, I like it.
I was tempted to write that on the ballots at the next one. Because it's kind of, yeah. I reckon that'd be funny if we just got a bunch of donkey votes that said you do not speak for me. But I think that would be a vote in itself. Do you think there's a limit to the non-aggression principle?
In what way? What do you mean? In
Just
that it doesn't.
in general, like it does it have a limit? So it's like if is there a circumstance where you would not consider it? That something that you're borderline sort of where you would disregard it?
Perhaps. I mean, I guess it would really depend on the situation. I mean, that's kind of a hard. Yeah. The nap is kind of a. It can get kind of a little bit borderline arbitrary in some places. And I guess this is where like private courts for like an ANCAP society would kind of come in play, and that it would be kind of a decision amongst a group that multiple people have kind of conceded to. It's voluntary. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's pretty hard, say what the. I mean, that is a hard question to answer. Yeah, the nap isn't this perfect thing, and it's also defined in multiple ways by different people. So it is kind of hard to have this hard and fast rule with the nap. I mean, at the end of the day, like in a true anarchist society, it would be defined multiple ways by different communities, and it would really just be a matter of finding the community that interprets it the way that you like. Like,
yeah.
I know, Stuart, you're not a big fan of Archie, and I've used him as an example before. Like he's been known to say stuff that like, I don't know, racism or something, or even just mean words break the NAP. And it's like, no, they don't. But, okay, let's say there are people that interpret that way. Like in an anarchist society, there would likely be some community somewhere that would interpret it in that way. And they would have probably their own private courts or community that agrees to a certain set of rules or whatever, that would, or a Hoppian society or whatever it may be that, interprets it that way. And that's fine. Whatever. You can have that place. You can have your community where, racism breaks NAP and whatever. I just won't live there. Like, I don't agree with it. So I guess in a way I would see, that almost as a breaking of the NAP. But it's funny though, too. Like we keep bringing up the NAP, but in like a certain ultimate sense, I also kind of don't believe in the NAP because, to bring up the egoism, I consider myself an egoist, but I see the NAP as more of like a useful, how do I put it? A useful social, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like social construct, essentially. Like that's what I see it as. I don't see it. I know a lot of us try to find ways to define it, with natural law or different other mechanisms as this like ultimate objective thing that exists or whatever, or is a provable thing. And I don't buy that. I find that hard to believe. But this is where the egoism comes in. It's just more that like that's what I think is the best way to lead towards a truly a free society, or a society that I would like. So, so in an egoist sense, that's what I like. So, that's what we're going with. So, or at least that's what I'm going to try to emulate and try to propagate. So,
yeah, it's interesting.
So you mentioned the Anatomy of the State, Murray Rothbard's book from 1974. It was probably the second book that I read. I read Liberalism by Mises first, but then I read Anatomy of the State. And I think that's probably a good starting point to discuss the Anarchist Handbook, which is a collection of anarchist essays from anarchists from all across the spectrum, from anarcho-communists to anarcho-capitalists and everyone in between. So I think it's a very interesting approach that Rothbard takes. He starts by saying, what the state isn't, as opposed to what the state is. Yeah. And I wanted to get your thoughts on why it's important to start that way, because it seems quite counterintuitive. Like, we've started the podcast by saying define anarchy, and then we're going forward from there. So why do you think it's important for someone like Rothbard to define what the state isn't before he defines what the state is?
I mean, the defining what it isn't, I guess, is more of the idea of dispelling the thoughts that people already have to begin with. Because that's the biggest thing, is people already have their own ideas baked in the cake of what it is. So normally, like, I guess if you're going to start out describing a whole new concept or something, you would start from the what it is. But being as he's already starting from the beginning point of people already have this idea of what this concept is, it's good to start off with what it isn't, to be able to spell and to give arguments of what it isn't. Because I can see the logic. Like if you started with what it is, everyone's just going to be thinking the entire time, like, no, that's not what it is, you know? So to start out with what it isn't is a good way to kind of, I guess, put at bay the naysayers, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. Like I was talking to someone just last night, in fact, and they said to me, as an anarchist, how do you have governance without government? And, you know, people have these preconceived myths and these notions of, you know, what the state is. And once you break that down first, then you can introduce new concepts. But I think it's important to you know, really, I guess, bust the myths of why the state is so good and so glorious and all hail the state. And I think going a bit later into the book, he talks a bit more about, and this is, I think, is the most important part of this book, as it is for us today, especially as Australians in COVID, is the intellectuals. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the intellectuals in the state and how they interact, especially, you know, with all the trust the science stuff we hear these days and trust the experts.
Yeah, I know this makes me a science denier, but or whatever. I actually don't even think I'm necessarily a science denier. I just think we've been told this thing from a young age that, like, you know, science is this, and then they tell you about, like, well, it's peer reviewed and blah 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 and this and that, but you don't take into account some of the incentives in place that drive it, you know, the ways it goes. For example, the very fact that most universities get some sort of government kickbacks. I mean, I don't know how Australia is, but that's, you know, a big thing in the United States.
It's all government kickbacks.
They're all government, almost all government.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I know there are some. I know in the States, I say this, but there are private universities and stuff like that. So I don't know how it is in Australia. So there are some that don't fit this mold. But even then, even in those institutions, you can make the case that, like, well, okay, those people are competing amongst their peers who already have these incentives in place, so they're just going to likely probably just fall in line with similar types of thinking. But yeah, the point being is, like, this community at whole is essentially incentivized heavily to, you know, do certain things. Because, for example, I guess I don't have a good example, but what I'm getting at is, like, say for a research, like, say some I don't know, say you have a biology professor and they want to study flies or whatever, like, they get grants for these things to do these research things. Like, a lot of these things come from, I mean, I guess sometimes, sure, it can be like a wealthy businessman or something, but let's be real. Probably a good portion of the time, I don't know whether it's a majority or a large minority, but there's a large amount of, like, government grants that come involved. So if it's something, you know, say with COVID, say it's something that's trying to disprove the going narrative, there is a pretty solid chance that you may not get that grant money you're looking for. And, you know, I know people would say stuff like the rebut to that would be like, well, you know, these people are good people. I mean, maybe this isn't it, but a lot of people would say, well, there's no way these people would consciously do this. It's like, okay, well, for one, there are people who would consciously make actions like that. But even then, let's say that's not even the case. Even subconsciously, there are incentives that kind of come in place and people just kind of fall in line and fall into a certain type of thinking. It doesn't have to be a conscious way of going. So, yeah, I mean, ideally, like, yes, if we were in a truly free society, like, you would be able to have this, like, oh, well, science is this and it's peer reviewed and blah 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 blah. But and I actually do believe in science. I will say that, like, but the science is just the scientific method. So, but now yeah, but now the idea that, you know, because the go-to people always say, it's like, well, these are peer-reviewed and blah blah blah, and like, okay, cool, you threw in a scientific journal amongst other people who have a similar thinking as you, who have the same incentives as you, and, like, I mean, yeah, sure, maybe for certain subjects that are in no way at all concerned with government or whatever, yeah, you may not have an issue, but I mean, let's be real, certain things drive a certain way, and that's kind of the point Murray is getting at too, in that, yeah. The whole idea of the intelligentsia or whatever. So,
well, if they benefit from the state existing and working with them, why do people out there who then speak against the state? You know, if you've got a few, I guess, elite or intelligentsia who are speaking out against the state, what benefits them?
What benefits them? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess
they want the state to think their way. That's all it is. It's just a power struggle. That's all it is.
I mean, sort of. I mean, like, I'm not even saying all intelligentsia are bad. Rothbard, I believed. I don't. I mean, not, maybe I'm wrong. I believe he at one point. I may be wrong. Maybe it's someone else I'm thinking of. I believe he had a professor position, and so he was in the same thing. It's not. I'm not saying all people. It's just it's the same thing with people in positions of government. Like, I mean, I may joke about all politicians, all this, but there are obviously going to be outliers. But it's the issue is an incentive problem. So it's just more that most people do this, and there are some outliers, and that'd be the same thing with like a Rothbard or I'm trying to think of other. I know there are plenty of libertarian individuals who held positions in colleges or in different scientific areas or whatever, and not they did the work against the state, but a lot of them struggled because they probably had a hard time getting grant money, etc., whatever. But yeah, I don't know. I guess for them, it really is just more of a personal thing. I'm sure there probably is some sort of, you could probably make the case that, being the one guy speaking out against the state kind of gives you a niche audience as
It's a bit
opposed to
daunting
being like,
too, I think.
yeah. Yeah, no, for sure. But I don't know. I mean, their incentives, I guess it's kind of hard. I'm sure they have their own incentives. That it's more honorable. They're against that.
Mm.
I
mean, it could be as little as standing on principle, which is not something that we see very much these days. I think principled people are few and far between.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, definitely.
Which is a bit concerning when you think about it.
Yeah, but even then, I would say with people like, say like a Rothbard type, or even then, it was probably somewhat self-serving in that that's what made him feel good. That's what he enjoyed. I mean, he probably saw, the same way that I kind of look at liberty from an egoist perspective of like, this is the kind of society that he wants to, encourage. Because that's what he sees as something that will lead to the most prosperous society, most peaceful, whatever. So I mean, there's probably some portion of that. I mean, I don't know if you ever had kids or anything. So I mean, I guess maybe there's not that, but I know for me, it's entirely self-serving for me, like being this, because this is the kind of world that I would like to live in. And, the best way to go about it is to, push these principles. Like if I don't want people to hurt people, and if I want people to not hurt people and not take my stuff, the best way to do that is to not hurt people and not take their stuff. And it's also good to then also encourage other people to do the same. And so say because I do have children. This is the world they're going to grow up in. So I mean, I know I'm not going to like change the world or whatever, but I can have my own effect in my own area, my own community, whatever. And hopefully I can push these forward that, make a world a little bit better for me, my children, my children's children, so on and so forth. So I know it's and I guess you could make the case for somebody like someone, one of our kind in the intelligentsia, is they're more making a low time preference type decision. So because I mean, with someone like the normal people that work for the intelligentsia, they're making the high time preference decision and getting the quick gains, the quick thing. But somebody like a Rothbard, I mean, think of the success of Rothbard now. Like compared to while he was doing what he was doing, I'm sure it's way higher than at that point. So, I mean, I guess it didn't really do much for him in that sense because he's dead, but yeah.
That often happens though, doesn't it? After people realize what they were saying after they die.
Yeah.
Seems to happen a lot.
For sure.
Which, yeah.
I think it might have been Dave Smith I heard talking about it on Joe Rogan Experience. He said, you don't know that you're in the revolution until after the revolution. I think that was Dave Smith, but that could be someone else, where he said, you don't know in the moment. It's only in when you're looking at, with hindsight, the power of hindsight, which unfortunately we don't have right now. It'd be so useful during COVID if we had the power of hindsight.
Oh, for sure. No, it is an interesting way to look at things because, if you're in a revolution or world-changing events, you're only in your little slice of time. So, and it's always going to seem incremental for you and not a sudden shift or change. I mean, obviously there are going to be exceptions, but it is an interesting concept to think about. And also, I think, falls of civilizations, collapses or revolutions or whatever. I do think we have our certain ideas of what those are, and those don't. And when actually put in those situations, they may not always look like what they think they look like. because it's different when you're looking at something from a historical perspective of, like, say, like the fall of Rome, and you're like, oh my God, Rome collapsed. And you're like, okay, well, yeah, but this happened over this long of a period of time. It may not have really been this disastrous thing for everybody involved. It was more just a thing of the state falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know. We have our own ideas, because I know a lot of people talk about, like, over in America that, like, we're on maybe not the brink, but we're not too far off from, like, a collapse or something. It's kind of like, okay, but what does that mean? Is that necessarily bad? I don't know. I mean, I guess it depends on your personal situation. I'm sure if you hitch your wagon to the state too much, yeah, it's probably going to be bad. So,
Could even see an inversion of classes, maybe, or a full collapse of the elites, because if the US dollar collapses, what's their wealth?
Yeah.
But
no,
who knows?
we're
Who knows?
it's literally a was it a house of cards? So it could collapse in a moment. So
I think a lot of people will be.
I feel like
very invested.
Without the elites, you wouldn't even have the likes of Robert Reich, for example. He exists because the state is there to support him. People like Robert Reich and there's other supposedly economists who have gotten rich from this. They really, like, without the state, we wouldn't have any of them. They wouldn't be in a position where they are today to influence what people believe.
Yeah,
I guess because they have control, because the government exists and supports them.
In a truly free society, they probably would have kicked Robert Reich off the cliff at birth. So I joke. He's like 4'11". I'm a short guy. I'm like 5'5", 5'6" ish.
Yeah, he's 1 meter and 49 centimeters tall.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
That's a short dude.
Yeah, he's very tiny.
Jesus.
It's funny looking at pictures of him with other normal sized people, let alone tall people. So, yeah.
Okay, so he was in. What was he in? He was in Clinton administration.
It's bad when short guys make fun of you for being short. So.
Yeah, it is very funny. I didn't know that he was that short. That's very entertaining information to know about.
Yeah, it is pretty wild to think he probably weighs like 120. Like, I probably would have an easier time beating him up than I would my wife.
It's funny. Every time I see something from him come up on Twitter, I'm just like, this is possibly the worst take I've ever seen on everything he talks about.
Yeah, he's pretty awful.
I don't know. But I think it does come back to, it is, he's parroting the state. It's like in Melbourne, we have PR guy, right, on Twitter. And it's just straight state propaganda, and if the state wasn't there, this person would be irrelevant. And it's also because I don't know. It's very interesting that these people build themselves up off the state, but if that doesn't work out, what are they?
Yeah. Well, a good example is Keynesian.
They're parasites.
Yeah. A good example is Keynesian economics. Like, that's like the going economics for like the establishment that they always rely on. But anyone who even like has a decent grasp on economics understands basically how retarded Keynesian economics is. But it makes sense. Like, it's the exact type of economics that serves the state if you understand Keynesian economics even a little bit. But yeah, Keynesian economics is probably the perfect example, and why like Austrian economics gets like kind of shunned, or even the Chicago school somewhat. Like, but I don't know, once you understand Austrian economics, it's pretty simple. I don't know. The more you delve into Keynesian economics, you're kind of like, how the hell is this like a thing that is like, the accepted thing? It makes no sense.
Yeah. You're talking about bad takes from Robert Reich, Jack. I've got one for you.
I'll
go to his Twitter right now. It's the second or third tweet on his Twitter page, and it's. I'll read it out for people who are listening to the audio only version. Reminder: Putin's means of keeping Western liberal democracy at bay isn't just to invade Ukraine. It's also to stoke division inside the West by fueling racist nationalism in Western Europe and the United States. Trump and Trumpism continue to be Putin's most important ally.
This is it's the worst takes. I've seen so many people mentioning Trump like on both sides. Just stop. He's not president. Cope.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is definitely. I'm not a foreign policy expert. But there's definitely cases to be made that things he did during his time. This is the whole problem with like presidents in general. Is it'd be like, well, this is Trump's fault. Well, this is Obama's fault. This is so and so's fault. It's the same thing with like economic things, especially if you don't have a firm grasp on economics. It's like pretty much all these people are kicking the can down the road. It's really hard to blame any specific president.
It's
this is a whole
the
ridiculous.
state.
Yeah, it's the whole ridiculous idea of this. Blue team, red team. And it's like, well, they both suck. I mean, yeah, sure, you can point to this person did that, because I've seen multiple takes throughout today with the whole Ukraine situation that like I somewhat agree with. So because I'll see one tweet that's like, well, this is Trump's fault because X, Y, and Z, different foreign policy things, and I'm like, okay, those are all true. And then there'll be somebody that's like, well, this is Biden's fault because the X, Y, and Z foreign policy thing. I'm like, okay, that's also true. And then somebody will be like, well, this is Obama's fault because the X, Y, and Z foreign policy thing. You're like, okay, well, that's also true. And it's like you can't really blame. It's the same thing with like economics, where it's like, a lot of people would say with Trump, like there was a period of time where like, oh, the economy's booming, and you're like, no, like that just means the economy is inflated right now, like big time, and it's really this ongoing problem, like with all the stuff in Russia and Ukraine. I'm no huge foreign policy guy. I go through phases where I get really big into foreign policy, and I'm not gonna lie, past year or so I've just gone exhausted. Like at some point you're like, yeah, I get it, war's bad. I don't need to know all the details. Like but it's good to be informed. But I don't know. It's just I'll probably in a year or so I'll get really reinvested in. But it's just this ongoing thing. Say with like Russia,
still here.
Yeah, with Russia, it's like we've been most of these like all this like stuff in the Middle East has been basically proxy wars with Russia. So it's like this has been an ongoing thing for decades. So like the Cold War never really ended. So like these are just like different proxy wars, different ones. Now it's just getting a little bit more heated, where it's getting closer to Russia's doorstep. I mean, you can blame who you want on it, whatever. I'm sure you can blame Putin, you can blame Ukraine, you can blame Obama, you can blame Trump, you can blame Biden, and you're probably going to be correct in every single one. So, I mean, depending on your reasoning, but there are valid reasons to blame every single one of them for it. But at the end of the day, it's like this is like, I guess, not to sound like a lefty, but a systemic problem, if you will. So it's like, I mean, we're both aggravating each other. I mean, if anything, I'd actually say the United States is more to blame. But yes, we're this is an inevitable thing that happens. You have nuclear powers playing war games with each other with the entire globe. Like it's going to accelerate and get worse and worse and worse. Like, and
to bring it back to Rothbard as well, you wouldn't have. It wouldn't be as bad as it is right now in Ukraine if it wasn't for the fact that the state protected the media and the elites. You have all these think tanks that are funded by, Lockheed and all the other military industrial complex industries, and they're funding these think tanks. They're not independent at all. They're funded by corporations that are funded by the state, and because they're then tied to the state, they're then going to advance and support war. The US has left Afghanistan. What replaces that? Ukraine. So suddenly you have all these elites who are being war hawks to benefit the state and to benefit the military-industrial complex. That's what it's all about, really. It comes down to people who are benefiting from the state then arguing in favor of what the state wants. And you wonder why that is, because they're biased, because they're being paid by the state.
Well, yeah, and most of them, too, are also paid by, like, I don't know, like arms companies and stuff. So usually a lot of these are, like, think tanks that are funded by, Raytheon or whatever, and they then obviously have a little bit of a bias, and I'm sure they get kickbacks from the state. I'm sure they have their own lobbyists, et cetera. Yeah, I mean it's very biased. Like, and it's one of those things where I'm trying to think. There's someone who said this, but I wish I could remember who said it. But like, say with like the media, because a lot of people be like, with the media, it's not necessarily that like they like say corporate media that they are like intentionally biased. I mean, I guess they are. You can probably say there's some combination of it, but it's more an idea of like there's a certain incentives there. There's certain frame of mind that occurs in the people that work there. There's also this idea of like it's not that necessarily like say you have someone who has these like war hawk takes. And it's not that they got on CNN or MSNBC and then decide to have Warhawk takes, or they did it in an inorganic way. It's more that they wouldn't have been hired if it wasn't for those takes. So it's like they may genuinely have those takes and genuinely believe them, but the only reason they're sitting there is because of those takes. Like they're not going to take the person who's the Scott Horton or whatever and be like, hey, you get to have a show on CNN or whatever. Like obviously, like that's not someone they're going to hire. And even then, of the people that hire them, it may not even be an intentional thing on their part. It's just a matter of that, like, it doesn't fit their vibe they're going for, and it's not necessarily they're doing it intentionally. It's the same idea. They had someone above them that only got hired because of their maybe possible genuine beliefs. I'm sure there's people at some point that are maybe the plotting, mustache twirling type people that are borderline genuine evil. But I think most of the time it's just a simple concept of incentives. Like these are the people who incentives are in place, and because of that, like that's how they landed these positions.
Talking about funding, not sure if you saw it or not, but there was a headline. I don't know whether it was old. It probably was old, but it was the Washington Post. They're like, war makes you safer and richer in the long run, right? Like, are you serious? And do we know how much Bezos is invested in the military-industrial complex? Because I bet you he is. I bet you he's got some kind of investment in there. And then there was another one that I saw from the senator in New Hampshire. She was like, as the threat of Russian invasion looms, we are united on the need to provide military assistance to the Ukraine so it can defend itself, right? And I looked up, I said, follow the money trail. Who's lining their pockets, right? I looked it up. 5 defense contractors are our top 20 donors: BAE, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, Sierra Nevada, and Honeywell. General Atomics, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin are in the top 100 as well. So if that's sort of, I wonder why she's saying that sort of thing. And you can find it through the money trail. It's always the money trail. You can always track it back.
Yeah, with that exact headline, I saw someone put out a really good meme today. I wish I could remember who it was or bring it up. But they, the 1984 line, like "War is peace," slavery is freedom, ignorance is something, I forget. And so they had like 3 separate, very recent articles. Like they had that one for war is peace. They had, the ignorance one, slavery or freedom is slavery. They had this like one article that recently came out that was like something they're like, freedom is this common thing of common rallying cry of racist or whatever. And so then they kind of like did this like weird circle back to slavery. And there was something about ignorance, about the idea of that, like, and this is one that was very common, that went around a lot, especially with all the COVID stuff. There was admissions from Fauci straight up that like, hey, we didn't release all the information because we were worried how you guys would interpret this. Like, yeah, no shit. Like, it's like, well, we can't like say it was like the mask stuff. I want to say it was the mask stuff. He said at one point, like, oh yeah, we knew that wouldn't work, that wasn't going to work, but we didn't want to like undermine the trust of the public or something. I'm like, that's just a fancy way of saying that like we lied and we didn't want to tell you.
Well, there was one instance where he lied about masks not being available, but because he was like, oh, but the health staff need it, right? And there was another thing where he's like, yeah, you could have just worn a scarf or like a the thin things is like a, it's still something. It might not stop everything. It might not be as effective as a mask could be, but it's still something. A jumper around your face would do it, right? But they didn't tell you that. They're like a mask only, and that's that sort of thing where it's like, well, the people who did their own research, whether that's the hysterical status who still won't take their masks off, or it's the people who don't want to wear them at all. It's the same thing. And then you've got that big 90% chunk in the middle who would just follow what the state says.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's definitely wild. It's funny with like the mask thing. They from the beginning, like I remember looking into, like, I was following Ron Paul on the Liberty Report, and he was going into all the studies, and like even now, like everything he said from the beginning is pretty much been held to be true. And if you look at the statistics or the most of the studies, the very few studies there are relating to masks, the majority of the studies seem to imply that the only one that even may have even marginal utility is the N95, and even that's debatable. And even then, it's like marginal. So it's like a minor difference possibly. And the cloth masks do nothing. And there's even good arguments to be made that they probably even are a detriment to your health. So
because people don't wash them.
well, yeah, that too. And it's like you're also like, even if you do wash them every day, it's still a perfect little hotbed for like bacteria and whatever, So, and then, with viruses, like you do shed them through your breath. So, but the idea is then you don't shed them, you're just breathing it right back in. So, by the way, I'm not a medical expert. This is just from secondhand information from Ron
all
Paul,
opinion,
so,
all opinion.
yeah.
I found that article you're talking about, Jack. So it's from 2014 from WAPO. It's written by a historian called Ian Morris. I actually own one of his books, Why the West Rules for Now. In the long run, wars make us safer and richer. Unfortunately, I can't read it because it's behind a paywall because it's the Washington Post. But what do you know? What do you know? I know. But what do you know? He's been given research fellowships by the Hoover Institute and the U.S. government's National Endowment for the Humanities program.
Look at that.
So,
the money trail proves true again.
A think tank and the government.
Yeah. And then I just looked up when Bezos bought the Washington Post. So it was 2013.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that the article, it's one of those things where like this is a common point Dave Smith brings up, that like you'll see things that like so-and-so country is a threat to democracy or whatever, and we kind of laugh at, but
always.
The point is like they're not lying, but the matter is it's the issue of like, well, who are they talking about? Like, are they talking about the state? Are they talking about you? Like what? Like it's a matter of how you interpret it. So with something like that, there's actually some truth to that, because especially with the United States, we talked about like the currency earlier. Pretty much the only thing upholding the value of our dollar is us deep dicking other, countries and being like, hey, guess what? You're paying for your gas in US dollars, and we'll go invade your country otherwise.
What do they call it? The petrodollar?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah. So that's the only thing really upholding our dollar, So there is something to that. I mean, it is definitely a house of cards. But if you are the establishment, the state, whatever, that's 100% true. That's the only thing. Yes, you are playing a house of cards, but it's one of those things that like you got to keep playing it or you're screwed. This kind of ties in the Spooner thing with the like one of the things he goes into his thing is the international money lenders and how they're all to blame, and like that debt. Like we don't realize, like a lot of people just think of it as just like this, oh, it's a debt. Like, oh, we can just default, or we can just do this, or we can do that. And like, okay, have you ever heard of Gaddafi? Like you don't just default on the debt. Like these people, yes, for maybe me and you, like that might not be a big deal if we default on the debt or whatever. But for the people that control the levers of power, that is a huge deal, because that is someone somewhere that wants their money, and they will find a way to get their money, or they will find a way to make you pay. And that's where you see people like Gaddafi, or I'm sure I can come up with other examples of individuals that clearly weren't playing the international money lenders game. I know that kind of like enters the conspiracy theory territory, and you kind of can't 100% confirm it, but there are definitely coincidental type things going on that you're like, yeah, it's heavily implied.
Well, I think you'll find that a lot of the actual socialists, the actual communists that take power, are quickly disposed of for whatever reason. But I feel like that might just be one of the primary reasons.
Yeah.
But it's definitely up there, the IMF and the World Bank and World Economic Forum and that sort of stuff. It's all sort of, the shadow government, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, and then you look at somewhere like Russia, and I'm not saying there's 100% why, but if you look at their national debt, and don't get me wrong, they have debt, but it's nowhere, like compared to other nations, it's not that bad at all. So, I mean, it does can make you wonder, like, okay, well, maybe there's some sort of international moneylender game going on here, and they don't like that there's one game. Like, I'm sure it seems like they kind of sort of play ball with the moneylenders, but they're not 100% in, They're kind of keeping them at bay because they seem to be a little bit more financially smart in that regard, as opposed to just being like, well, we'll just take money from any lender who wants to give it to us, and we don't have to at all come out positive. I mean, to be fair, I don't 100% know. This is more secondhand information. I've never looked into it personally, but it's my understanding their national debt's not that bad compared to most other nations. So
I'll look it up
Well,
quickly.
guess who their paymaster is? Russia has a different paymaster. That paymaster is China.
Mhm.
China has been funding the Russian military's development in the last 20 years or so after the Cold War because of the economic stagnation in the 70s and 80s. The Russian
Yes.
military, became
Yes,
obsolete.
China.
So China's funding that is funding their rebuilding a military. So their paymaster is China, and now China has decided to support Russia against the Ukraine.
Big money printer go burr. It's $280 billion. Russia's debt.
Oh yeah, that's like nothing compared to most other nations, especially ours.
I think Australia has around the same. No, Australia's debt is almost $1 trillion almost.
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's old data. That's pre-COVID data. By the end of COVID, it's expected that Australia's national debt will be around $2 trillion. We were, from memory, 963 billion before COVID. So we're going to be in that $2 trillion figure is a figure from last year. So you're looking at potentially doubling the national debt because of COVID.
Yeah, it's definitely gonna be a weird situation in the years to come for all
Jack,
of us.
What was Russia's debt again? Was it 280 billion?
Billion, yeah, US.
Victoria's is 200 billion.
God. Oh my god.
So a single state of Australia has almost as much debt as the Russians do. To put that in perspective.
Yeah, which is an indicator of essentially how cucked you are to the international money lenders. So, like, and you even made the point that then you add the extra dimension if they're pulling it from China that they're basically have a probably opposing money lender. Although I don't know where the hell China is getting their money from because they
print it because they don't care.
Yeah,
it's state capitalism. They don't care.
Yeah, no, which that is the other thing. It's like China is very much this paper tiger. Like I know a lot of people like to freak out the conservatives, whatever. And I guess that might actually be a good situation for Russia because if that's genuinely where they're getting their money from, is just their China's fiat that they're just pulling out of their ass themselves. It's kind of like, okay, like I guess when you have a kind of country like China, maybe you can kind of get away with that, but. I guess it may work out. So if China ends up collapsing, and it'd just be kind of like, oh, well, there goes your debt, Russia. Like I don't know, I don't know how that works with those countries. So I'm totally talking out my ass here. So, but
so could you say that China is a paper money tiger then?
Yeah,
it's all about printing money.
Yeah.
The one I got one final point from Rothbard, then we'll move on to one of Jack's. And it's that article by Ian Morris in the Washington Post. He made the argument in favor of Hobbes and the social contract, which is a big thing that Rothbard was opposed to. He pointed out in Anatomy of the State that the government became where it is today because of conquest and wars and invasion. And I think it's a very, very good point you made, is that there is no social contract because we don't really get a say in who our masters are. Even if we have voting, you don't vote for the bureaucrats, you don't vote for the military, you don't vote for all the government's corporations. I think that's a great point. Is the social contract?
What do the socialists say? There is no ethical consumption under capitalism. Something like that. Sounds about right.
I mean, the social contract thing is actually more of a Spooner thing, like in his essay there, No Treason.
Yeah,
because that's kind of one of the main points. Is it's kind of making fun of the Constitution, the American Constitution. Obviously, I don't know exactly. I'm assuming you guys are probably a constitutional republic now, which
nope.
What are
it's still a monarchy. It's constitutional monarchy. No. What
Australia? So we're a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary democracy.
Okay.
Those are
two of the worst systems ever.
Okay. Yeah.
So, but the problem
is,
well, it's going to be interesting because I think this is my prediction, is when the Queen dies, we're going to see a massive exodus of Commonwealth states from the Commonwealth. I think there's a lot of respect for her around the world, And once she's gone, all that respect is gone, and I think the crown might actually crumble. But
No,
I guess we'll see.
didn't you hear that
Maybe
the Queen's
COVID will
dead?
kill her. maybe
The Queen's
maybe
dead?
COVID will kill her.
Didn't you hear the theory that the Queen's dead and the Queen's being replaced by some actor who looks like the Queen? Didn't you hear about that, Jack?
I didn't hear about that. That's funny.
The Queen's dead. It's an actress.
It's believable, really.
But the other problem is if just before we move on to the next one, is if Australia was to become a republic, the people running the country right now will not do it properly. It will turn way worse than it already is, and that's my biggest issue, which is why I don't think that we should even consider looking into becoming a republic. But that's me, just because there's I just don't think the people in power right now have the capacity or the brain power to actually devise something that could protect people for hundreds of years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about your government, but I would think if they did, transition governments, especially if it wasn't some sort of revolution or crazy change, they would likely, like, if you did go the constitutional republic route, they would likely just probably create a derivative of it, and so it would probably just end up being a shittier version. So I can kind of see what you're getting at. I don't know, I could be wrong. I don't really understand your country at all. I struggle to understand my own. So yeah,
go check out my series on the ALN website called Australian Government. I'm breaking it down on how it works for everyone. I've got 2 articles out so far on how it works.
I'll be honest, I probably won't.
Nobody reads anymore anyway.
No, I always suggest if you're Australian to go check it out. Or if you're very
it's all podcasts these days.
Is it? Okay. Yeah.
So. All right.
It would be very random thing for someone like me not in your country to really go on a tear of how does this country's government work? I mean, maybe one day I'll get it, because it's kind of like sometimes you get in those rabbit holes of things you get interested in. Maybe one day.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So, are we going into?
Sure. One of your essays?
Do you want to look at Max Stirner? Because you mentioned egoism.
Sure.
I think that's a good tie-in. So do you want to go over that one and explain sort of his base for his essay, and we'll talk about that.
Sure. Are you asking me, or are you?
Yeah, asking you.
Yeah,
you probably have a better grasp of it than I do.
Egoism. I'm trying to think. I'm bringing up the page in case something comes to me. All things are nothing to me. That's a good way to start with. That's one of the beginning portions of that thing. Really, it's a better version of objectivism in my opinion. Like, I don't know if you guys are familiar with objectivism. It's with Ayn Rand, it's the concept of like selfishness or rational self-interest. It's the same idea, but brought to the logical extreme. Because I don't know, Ayn Rand goes kind of weird, different directions. It's basically the idea of that. It's kind of the starting point is you. And the funny thing is, like, when it comes to egoism, it's anarchy, but like in an ultimate sense. It's like, because there are ancoms that are egoists, or ancaps that are egoists. It's almost like this thing that like is undergirds it. So like, because it kind of like explains things like natural rights, stuff like that. Whereas it more just makes a point of like, well, those aren't a thing. Like he calls them spooks. Like, these are just ideas in your mind. Like, yes, I mean, I kind of made the point earlier that I see them as a useful concept, but I still understand at the end of the day, property rights are just something we made up. I do think there's a useful thing, and I'm sure you probably could point to specific instances in nature and be like, well, this animal has property rights or whatever, but you get in this really weird subjective area, and I find it easier just to be like, well, I find this to be a better way for the world to operate, and we're going from there. But yeah, it's really just a matter of, I guess they say selfishness, I guess would be a way to put it. Egoism, like you, it starts from you. So it's almost like you are the center of your personal world, and everything expands out from there, which sounds awful. One thing Stirner is most well known for is his concept of rights, which is the might makes right type idea. Because like a lot of people accuse like Sterner type people, or a lot of people, the gotcha for Sterner, for egoists, is always like, well, what about pedophiles or whatever, like, because per his idea of rights is like, you have the right to do whatever you can do, like anything you have a right to do. But now, like, if you get into what's called a clash of rights, say I want to do something but you don't want me to do it, and say you, like, if I'm able to do it, I had the right because I actually ended up doing it. Now, if you were able to stop me, you had the
That's
right.
your right as well, yeah.
Yes, because it's
I remember that, because that was one of the things that really stuck out to me for that
so
part, because the essay is very dense.
Yes, it's very hard to understand.
Yeah.
He's an interesting writer for sure, but it is it very much is might makes right, which people like scoff at and be like, oh my god. So the go to is like heinous things like pedophilia, and it's like the way I always explain is like, yes, technically per Stirner's concept of rights, the pedophile has the right to that, but you also have the right to go blow his brains out. So it's a matter of whose right wins out. So, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, this will evolve into crazy anarchy. And you're like, okay, but yeah, you have to exist in a world. So like you being an individual being like, hey, I'm an egoist and I can kind of do whatever I want. But now, do I really want to do this thing that will put me in this precarious position? No. Like, and it even is a matter of, say, to even bring it back to pedophilia. Do you want to do that? I don't. I doubt you guys do. And that's kind of an understanding of most people in the world. And yes, there are going to be people who want to. But you know what? I'd say the majority of people don't want to. And you know what? The cool thing is, if we have this concept of egoism, is or we're all a union of egoists, which is a concept within egoism, is we'll be like, well, screw that guy. Like, and I know a lot of people might like be like, well, a lot of people make fun of like, and this is one of the reasons why I like egoism, because like you get in like ANCAP world where a lot of people get in these like super autistic arguments, like say like age of consent, and like being an egoist, I get to be like, I don't care. Like the issue for me isn't consent. The issue is I don't like that, and the end. And that's kind of where it goes from. So like a lot of people can like argue like, oh well, maybe this age can consent, maybe this age can consent. I'm like, well, the consent's not the crux of the issue for me here. The crux of the issue is I find that abhorrent. The end. And that's kind of where it comes from. And if you were in an egoist society, I guess, if you will, it would be a matter of like, well, we're in a community, we don't accept of that. You can face the wall now. And that's really what it comes down to. And I mean, a lot of people with the might makes right thing will point out, like, I like to use the example of, like a lot of people will be like, you could go like, oh, in egoism world, you could just go kill your neighbor and do whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, but you live in a community, and even if it is a community full of egoists that think the same way as you, they're not going to like there's someone in their community who just brazenly does stuff like this. Like, they're probably going to take care of you. So, and it's like this ultimate concept of individualism is basically what egoism is.
It's super interesting, because I think egoism mixed with mutualism is probably a nearing perfect system. Because if everyone sort of requires each other to subsist in the world, or exist, or cooperate and be mutually beneficial to each other, while also having this idea, I think it's sort of a really good concept that would then go beyond this stupid argument of things like, well, I could do this. Well, sure, but that doesn't benefit everyone else. So it's sort of it requires that balance between these two things that kind of work together, but they kind of don't at the same time. I think it's a very interesting concept, and reading through it, I pulled a couple quotes which I'll try and find them, because I think they're pretty good quotes.
I love Sterner quotes.
But he's super fascinating. The writing was super fascinating. Just that sort of the rabid individualism, if you want to call it that.
Yeah. Whether I'm in the right or not, there is no judge but myself. I have the page open right now. I love Sterner quotes. Sterner quotes are great.
I wrote it down in my notes somewhere.
Which, to keep in mind for those who read the Anarchist Handbook, this is just an excerpt of Ego in Its Own, which is his Stirner's notable book. I don't think he has another book. I think he might have a couple of like articles or essays here and there. But yeah, there is a lot more in this section. I believe it goes more into like rights and the state is kind of where it focuses on. But Stirner's Ego in Its Own goes a lot more. Like the thing I always like to bring up is in Ego in Its Own, he goes into the concept of love, like egoist love, because a lot of people accuse like being an ultimate individual or like everything comes from you. Like, well, then how does something like love work? And you're like, or like, your family or whatever, like these things that people almost see as like borderline obligations. And it's this idea of like, from an egoist perspective, it's like, I love you because I want to love you, because I want to be with you. Like with my family, I want to be with my family. I love my children. I want to be with them. And that's kind of like the ideal thing that's like the best way to look at it. Because people have this weird inverse view of things as like obligations. And I guess in a sense, there's sort of an obligation, but I want that obligation. Like I want to be with my family. Like for me, that is something I want, you know what I mean? So, and it is kind of, I actually find egoism to be kind of beautiful, because if you really look at it, it's the idea of that the things that I do are because I want them to do it. If you are in my life, it's because I want you in my life. It's not because I feel like some sort of obligation to you or whatever. Everything comes from this place of because I want, in a certain sense.
Yeah. I found the quote. It was the social reformers preach to us law of society. There the individual becomes society's slave and is in the right only when society makes him out in the right, when he lives according to society's statute and so is loyal. Whether I am loyal under a despotism or in a society, it is the same absence of a right, in so far as in both cases I have not my right but foreign right.
Yeah,
because it's rights being granted to you by an external force. So
yes.
that one stuck out to me when I was reading through it the first time.
Yeah, no, I do like his idea of. I think he calls them egoist rights, or they might have a different definition, but yeah, no, he does make a good point of like rights in general are very slippery concepts. So to make it simply this idea of like, well, whatever you have the power to do, or like that is your right. And that is, I know for, ANCAPs, especially, a lot of them see that as reprehensible. It's almost an inverse of how we typically look at things. But if you really put in perspective and think about it and really, play it out, it's not that crazy. Because, yeah, a lot of people are like, well, you could just be a warlord or whatever. And you're like, okay, yeah, but maybe I don't want that. And also maybe I don't have the power to attain that. That's not within my right. I'm not able to attain that. I don't have the might for that, nor would I really want to. So, and
it's funny because even in the situation where a warlord would come to power, any one of the people around him have the power to end that.
Yes.
So it's that sort of thing where it's sort of self-checking in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So, and but the other, I guess, the downfall of it is you're requiring a reliance on someone's morals who may not be there.
I wouldn't say necessarily. I mean, I think you could be an egoist in a modern day world, and in egoism doesn't even look necessarily like he sees morality as a spook. Morality is nonsense, and I kind of agree with that in a certain extent because I'm not someone who believes in objective morality. But like, but at the end of the day, like, how do I describe it? Like when it comes to like good and bad things, or what people normally describe as good and bad, I don't have to use an objective morality to get there. I can completely come from it from a subjective perspective and be like, what, like, I don't know, say, I think an example. I mean, not to keep going back to pedophilia, like something like I see that as bad because I don't see that conducive to a good society. I don't like it. I think it's abhorrent, and that's really all I need to it. And that's like egoism at its core. It's like I don't. It's not necessarily a matter of like morality. It's just that from my individual perspective, fuck that. And it really doesn't require much more thinking than that. And whether that's like biological or individual, it kind of doesn't matter. I mean, my own individual perspective is screw that, and if I can get enough other people to agree with me, we can make some sort of initiative to deal with that. And you know, in an egoist society, or even a group of egoists, or even if you want to be an egoist in a society that's not full of egoists, you can literally just hack their morality or their
Yeah.
line of logic and convince them of why this is bad. They're like, oh, well, you think the floating man in the sky thinks that? Okay, yeah, that's totally why that's bad. Let's go deal with it. Like, I mean, whatever you got to use, you know. I mean,
Yeah.
it's funny. There's a portion too where he goes into like things like lying. You know, this is in the Ego Zone, on this excerpt in this. He goes into lying, how like, you know, when it comes to like morality being a spook, he basically goes into how he has no issue with lying. So say something like and like I don't either. I don't have a moral issue with lying. I have more of a practical issue with lying. I like to be someone that people can see as being someone you can trust as a source of information. So
Yeah.
I don't make it a habit of lying, but I can tell you damn sure if I'm ever in a situation where my ball's in a vice and lying is what will get me out of it, hell yeah. But it is a matter of like a cost benefit thing. If it's some like silly little thing, like, no, I'm not gonna lie. Why would I like impugn my respectability in any way for some slight, you know? But it would have to be something pretty big. Now, like if I'm on trial because I did something awful, let's say I killed someone, like, yeah, I'm gonna, if I'm under oath, I'm not gonna be like, yeah, I killed him. like I'm not an idiot. Like it's I'm honest, but to a fault, not to a fault type deal. So
Yeah.
yeah, and that's kind of the issue, like the thing with morality. Like if I had a concept of morality, like lying's bad, like I'd be like, oh, I can't do that. It's not necessarily an issue of that. It's more of a practical concern, you know. It's like, and I also don't really like to lie. It's kind of annoying. Like, why do that? Now it's inconvenient. Now I have to keep track of my lies. So,
Yeah. Yeah. That's what always trips people up, isn't it? They can't keep track of them.
Yeah.
It's almost always what trips them up. It's why politicians always end up coming out as liars, because they can't keep track of them.
Yeah.
I think it was Jerry that said to go to the politicians' first speech, their maiden speech, to figure out what they were actually like.
Yes, that was Jerry.
And then you compare it to their speeches now, and you'll see how they've changed.
In the modern day society is such a game changer with like the way internet is and stuff, because in the past, like these politicians used to be able to say whatever. They could say one thing at one speech in Nebraska, go to Texas and say something completely different, and no one would be able to trip them up.
Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, no one would be able to tell the difference, because it's like, what are you gonna do? Send some sort of, what are you gonna send mail to someone, you know, on the other side of the country and be like, hey, this is what she said? Like,
you were almost relying on journalists to tell you that they're saying something
yes.
different, which they never would. Or not. That's not necessarily accurate, but most, I guess, the corporate press, because realistically, people are like, oh, journalists were so truthful. If you really look into it, I doubt they were. I highly doubt it's changed at all.
Mm-hmm.
There are the principal journalists, and then there's the corporate press. So it's just that sort of thing.
I decide whether it is the right thing in me. There is no right outside me. If it is right for me, it is right. Possibly this may not suffice to make it right for the rest. That is their care, not mine. I love Sterner.
That's a good quote. He's so blunt. I think that's why it's so it rubs people the wrong way, because he's so blunt about it. He's not just trying to dance around what he means. He's just saying that if I want to do it, I'm doing it.
Yeah. And it is funny too when you do read Ego Zone. It is a completely, it kind of shifts your way of thinking about things, because it's like you read it and you think like, oh, this guy just wants to do awful things. He's a piece of shit. He just like, you know, whatever, you know, all the bad things that come to mind with selfishness or you know, some sort of extreme individualism. But then when you think it through, it's like, no, this guy actually is kind of describing sort of being a good person, but because he wants to be.
Yes. Yeah, because there's the good people who do it because society wants them to. But really, it's the outward appearance. It's the mask that slips, right? So the person is not the mask that they wear. So it's that sort of thing, and it's in the most simplest term, it's a brutally honest society. That's all it is.
Yeah,
I think anyway.
And that idea of doing good for the society when it's in your own interest is it's a concept called enlightened self-interest, and it ties in with Ayn Rand and the objectivists. Is that you're doing good for the community because it also helps benefit you. And I think it is a even though I'm not an egoist myself, I think it's a very good approach to take to life. When you're doing good things, is that you can do it for yourself, you can do it for your own self-interest, even if it benefits society. Like, people think that self-interest and the greater good per se, they polar opposites, but no, they can often overlap.
Yeah, for sure.
And egoism demonstrates that.
Yeah, no, the egoism is a very interesting idea, and that like it is. I'm not saying Ayn Rand stole it from him, but it is very much like it's weird. Like egoism is like when you read it, you can see so many other ideologies that like kind of seem to borderline spring from it. And maybe I'm not saying they did it intentionally. It's just a matter of like this is kind of way that ideas propagate. Like there's a little bit of postmodernism in there. There's a little bit of objectivism. There's a little bit of even like agorism and stuff like that. Like you can see all sorts of different stuff when you read it. It's really cool seeing that. And then you can also kind of see some of the commies ideas and some of the lefties. You can see some ANCAP. You can see all sorts of stuff in there when you read it. It's I don't know. I guess I hesitate to say I highly suggest everyone read it, but if you're someone who's a little bit more read on this stuff, because it is dense reading, it's weird reading. I don't even know how to explain it.
I had to go back a couple times for a few pages and reread the entire page because it's sort of it's so dense. It's very very dense.
Well, it predates Marx even. It's really old writing.
Yeah.
It is 1830 something, 1844.
Yeah, he was buddies with Marx and Engels.
Was 50 was 49 maybe was the Communist Manifesto.
I'm pretty sure he was buddies with Marx and Engels, or maybe not Marx. I'm pretty sure Marx got actually kind of pissy at him. If you read it, you actually see lots of critiques of Marx and Engels in this. So,
yeah,
like if you're paying attention, like
I always say that Marx was a moocher who made an ideology to justify his mooching. That's how I put it.
Yeah,
not a fan. But well, just an aside, just as we're sort of transitioning, where did anarcho-communism come from? Is there an essay in the book that talks about that?
I'll be honest, it's where I have a little bit of blind spot. Like, honestly, probably the extent of like ANCOM and anarcho-socialist stuff is not the extent, but a decent amount of it's what I've read in here, and it's only the little excerpts. I've listened to a lot of audiobooks of like Goldman, but I'll be honest, that's a spot where I haven't really delved too deep into the lefties. But yeah, I mean, I guess a lot of people make the case that Stirner was a lefty, but I think he kind of transcends that in a way. But yeah, I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I mean, Bakunin would probably be one for like an ANCOM. Like I know he's one of the ones to go to for, I believe, the ANCOM types. I couldn't give you too much aside from what I've read in here, and even then I'm not too well read on it. Like basically what I'm doing, I haven't done the Bakunin episode yet, but for just so you guys know, basically what I do whenever I do an episode is I'll usually, like, obviously I'll read it and then I'll try to get an idea of what a good guest would be for it, because I'm trying to pick guests that steel man the ideas or like that's basically genuinely their perspective. So I'm trying to find people who fit that. I'm trying to think of a good example of that. Who was one that was a good one for that? I don't know. I can't think of one on the top of my head. But and then what'll happen is when I pick one, and then whenever I decide to finally like schedule it, then I'll read it over and over and over again. So I'll read it multiple times to get a good idea of it. But I haven't done any of the lefties yet, really. So aside from Benjamin Tucker, I did that. But Benjamin Tucker is like an interesting example where he's like a lefty, but then the things he prescribes are very much in line with what we believe. So it's like the only, like, you could almost, like, if you read that Benjamin Tucker essay, there's like, I think there are a couple times he mentions like socialism, or like you could almost just swap out the word with like capitalism, and the majority of ANCAPs won't even pick it up. You know what I mean? Like, and there's only like one minor part, like there's like one part where he kind of talks about the labor theory of value or whatever. And like even then, most ANCAPs probably wouldn't even pick up on that little thing because, like, I mean, he's still at the end of the day, he's still prescribing anarchy. So it's like and like while he has a weird starting point, he ends up at the right finishing point. So it's like okay, like, and even then, the starting point's not that off. It's just a little bit off, you know.
So I was
from
doing
memory, ANCOM's come back from the late 1700s. He's looking French Revolution and then developing into the Paris Commune and the like. So it predates Marx even. Marx did not create communism. It existed before him. He reinvented it, per se.
I mean, sure, the idea of communal living isn't new. It's humanity almost. But I did just I was doing a little bit of reading while you were talking. I did find on the Wikipedia there's a poem that Friedrich Engels wrote about Max Stirner. It says, "Look at Stirner, look at him, the peaceful enemy of all constraint. For the moment he is still drinking beer. Soon he will be drinking blood as though it were water. When others cry savagely, down with kings, Stirner immediately supplements, down with the laws also. Stirner, full of dignity, proclaims, you bend your willpower and you dare to call yourself free. You become accustomed to slavery, down with dogmatism, down with law." So it's not bad. It's very interesting. So it says Engels recalled how they were once great friends. Later, Marx and Engels wrote major criticism of his work.
Yeah, I do like later in the Stirner one, he kind of goes more into like our relation with the state. Like, here's a good example of what he's kind of get. No one has any business to command my actions, to say what course I shall pursue and set up a code to govern it. I must put up with it that he treats me as his enemy, but never that he makes free with me as his creature, and that he makes his reason or even unreason my plumb line. And I don't know, it is very, I do like this section he picked that he goes into the idea of like, I forget how he puts it. I think he kind of goes into the ego versus the state, and kind of the idea how the state tries to get you to conform to it. And while you do need to some extent exist within it, like, because he brings up the point of making, like, don't make it your plumb line. Like, yes, you have to exist within it, but don't let it be your overriding, like, viewpoint or reasoning. You know, like, yes, I mean, maybe, you know, through egoistic means, not allow yourself to be put in a situation where they'll screw you over, but, you know, don't let that override your reason and accept this as the proper reality or the proper way of thinking, you know, and to let your ego rule over, essentially.
Do you want to go and discuss Goldman while we're here, Jack? Do you want to discuss Goldman while we're talking about communism? Because she's pretty socialist.
Yeah. I mean, we can talk about the idea, but I didn't get through most of that one, even though it is only 8 pages.
Oh, okay. Here's how he breaks it down. He breaks down his own will and the state, or the state's will, is how he breaks it down in there. And almost like there's two competing concepts going on at the same time: your will and the state's will, essentially. You know, and the idea is to not allow the state's will to override yours. Like this, people would let it. It would be like your sheep or whatever, just kind of fall in line with what the state says, kind of deal.
Well, generally, the will of the state is against the will of the people. Usually, the state is against their interests, working against the people. But they're just convinced us that it's for our own good, even though it often isn't. Like, going to war doesn't make you rich, doesn't make people wealthy. It destroys us. It destroys the economy, and it leads to more taxation.
Makes the rich
powerful. Exactly.
It
makes the rich richer and the poor poorer.
Yeah. I went on a spree posting stuff. It's like this one says, war is for empire, and empire only benefits the rich, which is true.
Yeah, here's another example. The master is a thing made by the servant. If submissiveness ceased, it would be over with all lordship. Own will and the state are powers in deadly hostility, between which no eternal peace is possible. As long as the state asserts itself, it represents own will, its ever hostile opponent, as unreasonable, evil, and the latter lets itself be talked into believing this. Indeed, it really is such, for no more reason than this, that it still lets itself be talked into such belief. It has not yet come to itself into the consciousness of its dignity, which is kind of beautiful. I do like how he like, you know, frames that as like your own will is like this beautiful thing that you just need to come to realize and accept. And that is actually a concept within ego in its own, where he kind of like, he actually kind of is like, we're all egoists. It's just a matter of accepting it and understanding it. Because even if you do exist in this thing, at the end of the day, this is the thing Ayn Rand kind of went to a lot too, is that like, in the day, you're all operating off of rational self-interest, to put it in Ayn Randian terms. It's just a matter of that you need to accept it and stop trying to fight it, because it's almost like this internal battle you're having, you know. And you know, for example, like it'd be a matter of like, you know, say with something like charity, like, or whatever, like instead of like trying to lie to yourself and you know, be like, oh, I'm doing it for, you know, these people. It's just a matter of like, just accept this makes you feel good. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, like if anything, it's weird that you're trying to fight this. Like just accept it, you know, and it'll make you much more at peace with yourself, you know?
That's funny. I didn't even think about it until just now. It just clicked as like Ayn Rand was probably the first political thing, like political ideological thing that I ever read. Like unwillingly, I just I heard about this book and I read it. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And that was maybe 2018 before I went to the US, I think. And it snapped me out of my conservative stage, which was fucking good.
Did you read one of her fiction books, or were you
it was Fountainhead, I think.
I read the Fountainhead too. I'll be honest, I do like the ideas I got of it, but I was not very impressed with the story overall. I know a lot of people have a different idea. Like I thought it was cool, but it came off to me as like,
no, it was the train one. Is that?
It's Fountainhead, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
It came off like someone started with, hey, this is the moral of the story. And now I need to make a story to fit this, as opposed to like, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it's good to have for a story to have a moral, but if like you're just trying to force the moral of the story, I don't know, it comes off as weird. I didn't find it particularly interesting, aside from
it might have been Atlas Shrugged, the one that I read.
I think if he's the train one, I'm pretty sure in Fountainhead he blew up a train, or maybe
no, it was the one with the chick, the chick was the main character, Dagny Taggart, I think her name was. I think that's Atlas Shrugged.
As long as I've read it, is Dagny? I don't know, whatever. One of the two. I never read Atlas Shrugged though. So, hi Spuderuckus. I see you in the chat.
Yeah, it was Atlas Shrugged.
Okay, I've never read Atlas Shrugged, so I don't know. Maybe it's weird. I've heard people that love Atlas Shrugged and don't love Fountainhead, and vice versa. Maybe it's just a taste thing. One of these days, I need to get around to reading Atlas Shrugged.
I enjoyed them both, honestly. I enjoyed them both, but that snapped me out of my. I think I was watching Steven Crowder at that point. So I've come on a big journey. It was like, because I went from wanting to join the military to now, so it's gone all the way down. So it's super interesting. Yeah,
I was similar. I was Steven Crowder back in 2018 as well, but before then, I was pro-Hillary. So,
oh boy, that's an even bigger jump.
Yeah,
I was never there. Crowder. I was never that. No, that's next level.
I had my Crowder period. I think it was like Shapiro, Crowder, then Rubin at some point. So.
I think everyone has their Crowder period. I'm pretty sure it seems to be a common trend.
Because I first sort of got onto the internet in that like Gamergate era. So I was watching all of those people. So all the Atheist Plus sort of shit, that sort of cringe time of YouTube.
Yeah.
And I've come all the way around, which is fun. Full circle.
The atheism community is pretty awful. I'll admit that.
It's so bad. It got so bad.
Yeah.
So bad. Yeah, it was. Bloody hell. Do we want to go into any other ones, or we
can touch on the Goldman a little if you want. I mean, I don't really. I'll be honest. I don't have much to say on the Goldman one because I mean, I have listened to a couple of her audiobooks, but that's forever ago. I don't remember much of it. But the essay in this isn't even really so much a socialist thing as it is like the way I interpret it. I had Thaddeus Russell on for that episode, and I think we had a slightly different interpretation of that essay. I kind of interpreted it as like like kind of like a populism / elitism type dichotomy type because the whole idea of that essay was the majorities and the minorities and how they interact with each other. And
that was the first bit. Yeah,
Yeah.
it literally says minorities versus majorities.
Yeah.
The one thing that really jumped out to me in the first half that I did read was which is very true and very relevant right now, which is the quantity quality thing. And that she's like and this was in 1910, mind you, that she was saying that quality was dropping for quantity and output, all that sort of stuff, which is very interesting, especially because she's Russian, right? And she was in the Soviet Union for a little bit.
I think so. Yeah, I know she got sent back to the Soviet Union at one point for with some of the war stuff. I forget. I'm shaking the historical aspects of it, but yeah, I know she got sent back to it at some point, and that she was one of the first people to like kind of blow the whistle and be like, "Whoa, this shit is fucked." And yeah, so
interesting. But yeah, that sort of jumped out to me that she was talking about quality quantity sort of argument, which is. It sounded like it was almost criticizing capitalism, which is probably what she was doing.
Sort of, yeah.
Or because it sort of spiraled and become that now anyway. So
yeah. I mean, to be fair to her, I'd say she was criticizing state capitalism. I also kind of interpret it as a way to kind of interpret how ideas move within a social atmosphere, if you will. So, because she didn't only apply it to that, because she used it to kind of explain art. And I do think there are some flaws to the way she explained it, but there's definitely some explanatory power in some things, in the idea of certain concepts arise, and then once it reaches the masses, it kind of dilutes the message, and it kind of gets perverted to some extent, depending on what the thing is. And the whole idea of like these minorities drive concepts, whether it be, I don't know, say, even libertarianism is a good example of it. You have, I don't know, you have the Rothbardians or whatever that drive, where you could call them the minority, and have this idea that they push forward. And then along the way, it gets perverted by the reason, the Cato types, whatever, what have you. And it kind of slowly becomes this thing that they can shift the language. Once it ends up in the larger, once the idea disperses to the majority, it kind of becomes more, I guess you could almost say it's less concentrated, less pure. It becomes a tool to be fixed. Like I think one example I use, I don't even remember if it's in the book. A good example would be like Christianity. I know I'm not even trying to pick on religion. I'm saying like, because the example I would use like the Crusades, like, that would be a good example of like, here's this idea of Christianity. And then it started as this like small group. And then as it dispersed, it became, in some aspects, some places used it to their own ends, and the idea got diluted. But some of the Crusades,
well, Christianity, I can speak on that.
Yeah, I mean, I was the only example. We don't have to go too deep on the Crusades if you want. That was a good example in mind. Yeah, go ahead if you want though.
No, but I think you are right. Is that with stuff that is often a good cause ends up getting diluted. I wanted to briefly mention up until Constantine. The Christian Church was basically the welfare state it did all the welfare stuff in the Roman Empire was carried out by the Christian Church until around 312 or so, and then suddenly it got corrupted because it was seen as being popular and being good. So all the rich people then got involved and corrupted it. I think that's a big problem that we have in society as a whole. Anything that starts off good then gets corrupted by people who are rich and powerful and come in and use it for their own cause and use it for their own good. So and that is like, even though that's what almost 2 millennia old, it still happens to the States. It's an ongoing lesson we have in history, is that any good cause can ultimately be corrupted.
Yes. And it's the idea and that's one big thing she goes into, that these ideas come up from this minority, whether it be one person, a small group. It is like this idea is held within it. This minority drives the idea, and it kind of, propels society forward in this whatever positive way. And then over time it gets diluted. And then the next thing comes up eventually. And that kind of, and that's the way I kind of interpret it, and I find it to be, I mean, don't get me wrong, I think it has its flaws in some regards, but I think it's a good way to interpret the way the ideas move throughout like the populace at large, if you will.
Well, this passage here is quite interesting. It says, "Yet when the crimes of the party become so brazen that even the blind could see them, it needed but to muster up its minions, and its supremacy was assured. Thus the very victims, duped, betrayed, and outraged, 100 times decided not against but in favor of the victor. Bewildered, the few asked how could the majority betray the traditions of American liberty. Where was its judgment, its reason, capacity? That is just it. The majority cannot reason, it has no judgment. Lacking utterly in originality and moral courage, the majority has always placed its destiny in the hands of others. Incapable of standing responsibilities, it has followed its leaders even unto destruction. Dr. Stockman was right. The most dangerous enemy of truth and justice in our midst are the compact majorities, the damned compact majority. Without ambition or initiative, the compact mass hates nothing so much as innovation. It has always opposed, condemned, and hounded the innovator, the pioneer of a new truth. So it's very interesting that
Basically,
she's it's just it's individualism again. It's heralding individualism, saying that the individual is smarter than the majority almost always.
Yeah, and she's also making sort of a case for elitism, is kind of the way I see it, and I kind of somewhat agree with it. Although I can understand arguments for populism as well. If anything, I think it's almost a little bit of a false dichotomy in some ways. But it's kind of the idea of like, for example, I don't think we necessarily need a society full of libertarians or anarchists to have that society. All you need is, like, if you have people within the elite, in a Hoppian sense, the true elite, the proper elite, to kind of have this thing, and the populace at large generally just kind of falls in place. And yeah, they may not be libertarians or anarchists or whatever, but
they'll subsist under the system.
Yes, so they'll just kind of fall in line. Yeah.
So it's I can't remember who said it or where it came from, but apparently to change society, you need about 5% of the population.
Yeah. Yeah, if we had 5% of people, libertarians or anarchists or whatever, that, I don't, like, if they were just, and I don't mean like pieces of shit, I just mean like people who, are in the community, upstanding people who live good lives, ideally people who are in like positions of power. And I don't mean that in like a bad way, whether it be someone who's, who has a local grocery store and is the owner, or, someone who has a large, contracting business or whatever, just people within the society that have these ideas that are like upstanding people. If you have enough of them, it just gets to the point where people just kind of like, oh, that's Joe down the street, and he's kind of a decent presence in our community, someone that we kind of respect and emulate. And then I think people will just kind of fall in line. It's kind of like living by example type deal. So and you don't need to convert them. You just they just kind of like understand, like, here's so and he seems to have a decent life, and I'm just going to kind of roughly emulate him. So
and this is why I always mock the left people who always do the theory arguments. It's my favorite thing, because everyone that does it, I'm just like, I don't care about your theory. Does it work in practice?
Yeah.
If it works in practice, it'll catch on.
Yeah.
So it's just, and this is why I always mock them every time they're like, oh, but in theory. Well, I don't care about your theory.
Yeah, if your thing in theory, like the whole idea of theory is for it to be something that has explanatory power in the real world. If it's in theory, then it's like, okay, well, it's useless. I mean, I do get irritated with libertarians, anarchists who like will shit on people. They'd be like, oh, well, you're just a libertarian purist, or you're just, standing on principles, or you just this theory, that theory. And you're like, okay, well, either my theory is wrong, or like it's really all it comes down to. Like, like a lot of people will say, be like, oh, well, we can't just be, you can't be so focused on theory. Like, well, the whole idea of theory is to put it in practice and for it to have explanatory power. Because a lot of people are like, oh, we can't just be principled libertarians or principled anarchists right now. Like, Okay, what do you mean? Like, if are you saying my theory's wrong? Because like, if that's the case, okay, let's talk about it. Like,
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're just saying, well, I don't like what you're saying. Like, this is
Yeah,
some way of
and like
answer I'm
when
giving you.
when I say I mock the
Oh, yeah, I know what
theory
you mean.
people is because it's like it's all you ever see, especially for a label like communist,
Yeah.
which has never been able to work in practice, and I think that's because it almost always has to transfer through a system of socialism. And what happens when you centralize power? People don't give it up, right?
Yeah.
Which is what we've seen every single time. Is it's socialism? They say we're going to go to this. They get absolute power, and then nothing happens.
Yeah, I know what you meant.
Because
It's the generic idea with people always say, well, in theory, communism this. And the idea is, but I'm kind of pushing back, and I'm not even saying you said this. It's the idea of that, like, well, no, your theory sucks. Like,
yes, yeah,
if
yeah,
you,
and that's what I was getting at. That
Yeah.
when and it's specifically like the communist stuff because I studied 20th century revolution, so obviously I've studied communist revolutions and that sort of stuff, and I'm like, well, they always come out with the theory and then they put it into practice and it goes to tyranny. So
Yeah.
clearly your theory sucks.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
take
No,
your the theory argument and go somewhere else.
Yes. I mean, it's the idea of that if you, I mean, essentially theories are like the equivalent of like blueprints for something. If your blueprints don't work, you can't be like, well, the blueprints are perfect. And like, what do you, especially if you're like saying, hey, the blueprints are perfect and everything you guys did like are according to the blueprints. Like, well, then something's off here. It's clearly the blueprints. Like,
Yeah.
like you
Oh,
can't
but
just be like, oh, well,
it'll work if we have certain materials. Yeah, well, that material doesn't exist.
yeah.
That's sort of where it is.
Yeah.
Mm.
I wanted to finish up by looking at Lysander Spooner's essay, No Treason and the Constitution of No Authority, which is admittedly applied to the US Constitution, but I think it still applies to the Australian one, especially in the context of voting, where the voting means you consent. Because for those who don't know, Australians have mandatory voting for people of all ages over the age of 18, and you get fined if you don't vote. It's only a small fine, less than $100, depending on the jurisdiction. But it still is a fine nonetheless for not voting, and you have to vote on a Saturday as well. Every election day is held on a Saturday, so you have to go out, on your weekend to go vote, even if you don't want to. And if you don't want to go because you don't like voting, you get fined for it. You get punished for not voting. So can we really consent with our vote in Australia? And I want to read this. It's a long quote, but it's from Lysander Spooner. In truth, in the case of individuals, their actual voting is not to be taken as proof of consent, even for the time being. On the contrary, it is to be considered that without his consent having ever been asked, a man finds himself environed by a government that he cannot resist, a government that forces him to pay money, render service, and forgo the exercise of many of his natural rights, under peril of weighty punishments. He sees, too, that other men practice this tyranny over him by the use of the ballot. He sees further that if he will use the ballot himself, he has some chance of relieving himself from this tyranny of others, by subjecting them to his own tyranny. In short, he finds himself, without his consent, so situated that if he use the ballot, he may become his own master. If he does not use it, he must become a slave. And he has no other alternative to these two. In self-defense, he attempts the former. This case is analogous to that of a man who has been forced into battle, where he must either kill others or be killed himself. Because to save his life in battle, a man attempts to save the lives, to take the lives of others, neither in contest with the ballot, which is a mere substitute for the bullet, because as his only chance of self-preservation, a man uses a ballot. It is to be inferred that the contest is one into which he voluntarily entered, that he voluntarily set up his own natural rights at a stake against those of others, to be won or lost by the mere power of numbers. On the contrary, it is to be considered that in exigency into which he has been forced by others, and in which no other means of self-defense offered, his matter of necessity used the only one that was left to him. Now, that is 1800s English. It's not the best to read, but the basic gist of that paragraph from Spooner is that just because you vote doesn't mean that you get into the government, because you have no other choice. And especially, I think in Australia, we get a lot of shit from Americans in particular for voting on election day, and I think it's like, well, just because you vote doesn't mean you consent to what the government's doing. And I think that's probably a very important distinction to make. Just because you vote doesn't mean you agree with the government, or
Still
just because
pending
you vote for. Okay, Jack. No, you vote for the least bad party, simply because you want to try and act in your own self-interest, because that's all you can do, really.
Yeah.
And I wanted to get your thoughts on that as an American.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a stronger case for you guys you made, since it's mandatory, that the idea that Spooner is getting at, because I mean, a lot of people are aware. I don't know if you guys are. Where I come from, I would consider myself an agorist, which would generally be someone who would prefer not to use the political route in any way, shape, or form. Essentially, like I don't think voting necessarily or generally will get you to your desired ends. I think you're better off not voting. I also think you're better off not trying to take positions of office, or so on and so forth. I know a lot of people be like, "Oh, well, messaging," but I have arguments for that. But point being is, I still don't. And this is where I kind of come at odds with some of my agorist compadres, where they will make the argument that like voting or political action is immoral. I don't think it's immoral. I just think it's I think it's not like pragmatic or practical towards your ends. But like the reason why I don't think it's immoral is for this very reason, because I do take Spooner's approach, and I do think I mean maybe he overstates it to some regard in a certain extent, of the idea of that like you're going to you're forced between these two things. I do think most people think they are forced. For you guys, you kind of are, but for like an American, it's like you can always choose not to vote, and I guess you guys kind of can, but you're going to pay a price. But even then, most people would see that and be like, okay, but what we're voting on is my property or whatever. So it's like, it's the idea of that, like, if I don't vote, I'm kind of leaving it up to, the populace at large to kind of make a choice on my given property or whatever, So, but I mean, I would make, as from an agorist perspective, would make the thing that it's like, yeah, generally speaking, you're kind of fucked either way. You're better off just trying to step away from the system to the best extent you can. Maybe make yourself to be, maybe put yourself in a situation where you're less able to be, you have your property taken from the state to whatever extent you can. But point being, as I do think there is a good point to that, in that for most people, they do see this as a, the idea of that I'm given two choices. So the idea that Spooner is getting at is what he's breaking down here is the idea that voting somehow confers consent towards the government. And I definitely think it doesn't, because people are put in a situation where they think, hey, I'm being given this choice by this superior coercive power that is
it's the illusion of choice.
Yes, it's the illusion of choice. Yeah. You're being put here, and so you making that choice doesn't necessarily mean that that you consent to being governed by them because you voted.
Yeah, and Australia, I think Australia has this in spades, honestly, because this illusion of choice and ranked choice voting kind of go hand in hand, because you don't really end up getting the people that you want, because there's not going to be a prime minister that isn't from one of the two major parties. Like, that's just the facts of it. Like, there is no chance that we will get a minority prime minister ever. Like, it's just, unless everybody votes for a minor party, there's absolutely no chance that we will ever see a prime minister from any party that isn't Labour or Liberal. And like, it's the same in the US. Are you ever going to see a libertarian president? Don't think so.
I mean, it's a possibility, but my argument would be at that point, once you ever get to a point where you actually have a viable option of a libertarian party, it's probably been so bastardized that it's basically not a libertarian party anymore.
Yeah.
That's when you end up with the Sarwarks, the Robbie Suaves, the whatever. I mean, I don't know if those names ring a bell to you.
The Archie Flowers.
Yes. Well, I wouldn't even say Joe Jorgensen or Archie Flowers is a good example. I would think Sarwark or Robbie Suave would be a better example.
I mean, she boogied. What is she doing now? Where'd she go? She collected her money and dipped.
Yeah, I don't know. She's going. I don't know. She's in her sex dungeon. I don't know.
But I kind of. So it's like the American voting system is very interesting, because it seems like they're trying their hardest to make sure people can't vote. or trying their hardest to make sure that it's voted the way that they want it to. And I think one of the biggest red flags to me about the US voting system is that it's not a public holiday or on a weekend. I tell you what, if you want to see people vote in America, give them a public holiday and be like, hey, voting's today, you got the day off. Vote if you wanna. And I think that should be the same here. It shouldn't be, here's the day, go vote. Right? It's more, here's the day, if you want to vote, vote.
Yeah, I don't know how much of that is intentional or not, but there is something to. I mean, don't get me wrong. We have conservatives and we have liberals. Essentially, we have the Democrats, Republicans, and well, I mean, if we're gonna make sweeping generalizations, let's be real. I'm not saying the conservatives are amazing, but I would say, generally speaking, they're usually somewhat preferable, to the liberals or the Democrats. And generally speaking, making sweeping generalizations of the stereotypes of people within each party. If you're doing it on like a weekday or whatever, or not a convenient time, you don't make it a holiday. Generally speaking, the conservatives, Republicans are going to be the ones that have jobs, things to do. It's harder for them to get to voting. And the other ones, it's also more driven into their head of those ones that like, oh, get out and get the vote, type deal. So there's something to that. But at the same time, I'm also like, less voting the better. Like a lot of people get like freak out about voting rights and like, oh, we need to make. I'm completely fine with if like the idea of the Constitution initially was just property owners or whatever. I know it was like also just men, just whites, whatever. But the less people to vote, the better. Like, and this is the kind of idea like with Hoppian's concept of that like monarchies are preferable to democracies and anarchies preferable to monarchy. It's like the less people vote, the better. Essentially, a monarchy is just someone with one vote. Because it's like the less people vote, the more of a import is put on your vote, the more of a stake you have in it, etc. If you're a monarchy and you make a bad vote, that might be your head. So, yeah. So it's not to say monarchy's ideal. It's just I think it's actually preferable to a democracy, and then anarchy is preferable to monarchy. So.
Yeah, I actually had someone have a go at me because I said that democracy is shit. I'm like, clearly you don't understand.
Yeah.
It's not my problem that you don't understand.
Yeah, if we give everyone an opinion on super important matters of a stake in something, it'll totally turn out well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all you need is 50.1%, and then you can order around the other 49.9%. That's it.
Yeah.
That's
I need to fix my car and I need help on it, so I'm going to give the entire nation a vote in how I proceed with this. I'm sure this will work out well.
It's basically the Swiss system then, because they vote on all major laws. All Swiss people vote in a referendum on every major law, I'm pretty sure.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. Really, like it's better than a representative democracy, because representative democracy still puts the populace's voice with one person. It's still a flawed system where if it's where a system like that, everyone gets a say, right? Everyone gets to say their piece. Where my issue comes from that representative thing where it's like, oh, we have to vote and then a single person represents that vote. Well, that doesn't work, because that one person can be corrupted with money at a bare minimum, right? And that is so easily abusable and this is, that's a whole other argument though. So,
well, at the same time, people can be seduced by offers of free stuff.
Yes.
By government. So they're going to be corrupted.
Generally speaking, I think the less people who vote, the better. So, generally speaking.
Yeah.
I think it's probably a good spot to finish up on.
Yeah, I think so. Finish up fuck democracy.
So where can people find you, Jose?
I'm on YouTube. My show is No Way Jose. I'm Jose Galison. You can find me on YouTube. I also have the Tower Power Hour show that I'm a co-host frequently on. That's on YouTube. That's also on all the major audio podcatchers. With Tower Power, I would suggest doing on YouTube or Odyssey. It's more of a viewing thing. But some people like to listen to it, so whatever. But my show is No Way Jose. It's on YouTube, all the major audio podcatchers, Odyssey as well. If you want to follow me on Twitter at 2020 No Way Jose. And like I said, we're doing this Anarchist Handbook thing. I have some good stuff. I've got a few episodes of Dave Smith. I've been doing live reading on like agorism type stuff recently. I know that's not as flashy for a lot of people, but I've been enjoying it. So I don't know. Come check out my content if you like what you heard here. If not, then don't. I don't care.
Thank you, and thanks for joining us today.
No worries.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.